Thank you for the song this morning. We will be going to Isaiah chapter 54. We are continuing our series through the book of Isaiah, and this is now message number 72, entitled The Beauty of Zion. And we'll be looking at chapter 54 in this message, and I'll read the first 3 verses to get started. Sing, O barren, thou that didst not bear. Break forth into singing and cry aloud, thou that didst not travail with child. For more are the children of the desolate than the children of the married wife, saith the Lord. Enlarge the place of thy tent, and let them stretch forth the curtains of thine habitations. Spare not, lengthen thy cords, and strengthen thy stakes. For thou shalt break forth on the right hand and on the left, and thy seed shall inherit the Gentiles, and make the desolate cities to be inhabited. So Isaiah 53 that we finished last time was the fourth and final servant song in Isaiah. And that servant song presents the rejection, the suffering, the death, the burial, the resurrection, and the exaltation of the servant of Yahweh in order to atone for Israel's sins and reconcile the nations to God. Now, Isaiah 53 is the crucial linchpin in the promises of redemption and restoration for national Israel and the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the blessing of the nations through them. Because we can find those promises from very early, even in the books of Moses, we find those promises about that future restoration, and they go all through the Old Testament. But Isaiah 53 is the place that clearly contributes how that is to be accomplished. And it is to be accomplished through the penal substitutionary sacrificial death of Jesus Christ in the place of sinners and national Israel and the nations who are cleansed by his shedding of blood. Now, the end of the song in Isaiah 53 describes the exaltation and the reward of the faithful servant, and the inheritance is possessed and blessings abound. And that's the note that we end on in that song. Now, Isaiah 53, when you look at it and you pay close attention, you follow those pronouns through that song, Isaiah 53 is primarily the future confession of national Israel when they look on the one that they rejected and that they pierced, and they acknowledge their sins in repentance and in faith embrace the Messiah sent to them long before. Well, chapter 54 following functions as a response to Israel's confession. So as we begin to read in chapter 54, we're reading the response to Israel's national confession in chapter 53. And really this response, it reminds me, at least in some ways, of the parable of the prodigal son's return and the reception that he receives, even though in his mind he thinks, I'm not worthy, I've done wrong, and maybe that I can at least be a servant in my father's house. And of course, he receives a much greater reception than that. And that's sort of puts me in mind of that when I read this response to Israel's confession. Israel is called on to sing praise for the fulfilled promises of restoration. And we find here that this legal separation that we read about several chapters ago is ended. And what Israel has lost in exile will not even compare to what is gained in restoration. So we'll look at this chapter in 2 parts. Verses 1 to 10 give us the command to sing and do not fear, do not be afraid. And verses 11 to 17 give quite a description of the beauty of Zion in that future restoration. So we'll start here in this first part, and we'll read verses 1 to 3 again. Sing, O barren, thou that didst not bear. Break forth into singing, and cry aloud, thou that didst not travail with child. For more are the children of the desolate than the children of the married wife, saith the Lord. Enlarge the place of thy tent, and let them stretch forth the curtains of thine habitations. Spare not, lengthen thy cord, for thou shalt break forth on the right hand and on the left, and thy seed shall be Gentiles, and make the desolate cities to be inhabited. So the exhortation to sing is something that we have already encountered several times here in Isaiah, and particularly in this future restoration time. It is a singing of a new song that is occasioned by the new Exodus. In other words, when God's indignation against Israel has been ended, when it has been filled to the full, and he will have it no longer, there will be a new song when they are gathered and restored. And so this is right in line with that. So it is also connected immediately to this previous chapter in Isaiah 53, and particularly the deliverance from sin through the sacrifice of the servant, the Messiah, the anointed of God. Now, the immediate reference in verse 1 is to Israel as a barren woman. And Israel as a barren woman is imagery that is used to describe Israel in exile and in dispersion, in being scattered. And we saw that quite extensively back in chapter 49. And God makes it very clear, though, that yes, they appear to be forsaken, they appear to be a destitute wife, but they have departed because of sin. If you recall in chapter 50, Israel actually made that accusation against God as if they were a wife that has been abandoned and forsaken of her husband. And of course, God answers that in that chapter. And so they are in many ways, a present deplorable condition that is because of sin. Now, Isaiah has the most developed use of feminine imagery for Israel. So there's other prophets that use a feminine imagery. Hosea is one. And Hosea primarily uses the imagery of an adulterous wife. So Israel as an adulterous wife that highlights her covenant unfaithfulness. Jeremiah also uses the image of Israel as an adulterous wife, and also uses the image of a woman in labor as imagery of judgment that is upon Israel through coming at the end of the age, in particular in the exile. Ezekiel also uses the imagery of an adulterous wife. He presses that just a little bit further as an adulterous wife that's even prostituting herself. This is very stark language in Ezekiel. Micah also uses the imagery of a woman in labor, again, that speaks of that judgment. So those are the primary uses of this imagery outside of Isaiah, but Isaiah is far more developed than these other prophets. In fact, if you read Isaiah from beginning to end, what you get is sort of a biographical narrative of a woman, Israel as a woman. So there's, first of all, it opens up in chapter 1, and Israel's depicted as a harlot. And so covenant corruption is depicted there through that imagery. And then there is, by chapter 3, an impending judgment on Israel as vain daughters, vain, proud, arrogant daughters in chapter 3. And then the woman in labor, which is the imagery of judgment, which even carries on into the New Testament. Isaiah also uses in chapter number 26 when he's speaking about future judgment that is to come upon them because of their sins. And then a woman as a barren woman, so she has no children, she has none to care for her, she has no family, she is alone and abandoned and in poverty, and that is used as imagery to speak of Israel in exile. In other words, it's sort of, I think one of the things that Isaiah compares is to a tent, some very ramshackle sort of affair that would not be able to stand up to the wind and the storm and that sort of thing. In other words, showing vulnerability and helplessness, and that comes out in chapter 49. Though chapter 49 also hints to a reversal of that image. And so when we get to chapter 54, now we get this image, this barren that is depicted as a mother giving birth. And that speaks of the future restoration and the future kingdom. And then when we go on from here, we'll get Israel then as an adorned bride in chapter 61 and as the mother of a nation in chapter 66. So again, Isaiah uses the most developed imagery of Israel as a woman. And from chapter 49 to chapter 54 is where that image really turns toward restoration. So this image is used to depict all of the problems that Israel has and all their sufferings and afflictions. But here we're seeing a turn toward that being reversed. So the command is to sing. She is a wife, as we saw back in chapter 50, that has been separated from God, but she's not forsaken. She's not forgotten. She's not abandoned. He will gather her again, and she will be in honor and will be abundantly fruitful. And that's, again, hinted at in chapter 49 and are referred to again here. Now, Paul actually refers to this first verse in Isaiah 54 in Galatians chapter 4, verses 26 to 27. And so in the context here in Isaiah, Israel is despised and is unfruitful, while God's hand is very heavy upon her to chasten her. But in the end, she shall be redeemed and restored and will surpass all the women who despised her in history. Now, in Galatians, Paul is there contrasting Hagar and Sarah, Hagar and Ishmael as the child of the flesh, and Sarah and Isaac as the child of faith or of the new covenant. And so, likewise, it's the seed of faith that will inherit the promises. Now, he goes on to speak about the need to enlarge the tent. In other words, in this reversal and in this restoration, this one that was so long barren in exile is going to bring forth abundant children. In fact, so many children, so many offspring, there's no room for them, so to speak. The tent will have to be enlarged. It will stretch forth and lengthen and break forth to the right hand and the left that it speaks about. So here we get the contrasting picture. So before we had the desperate, lonely woman who would only need, of course, a very small room, and she shall have to enlarge her house here for all of her children in this time of restoration. And when we read about the extents of the Messiah's kingdom in that future time, of course, that will cover all of the earth. But notice what is spoken of here in verse 3. Thy seed shall inherit the Gentiles, this is Goyim, the nations, and make desolate cities to be inhabited. And what this speaks of is the fact of that restoration on the scale of their possession of the land that has been promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which they have never yet fully occupied. And it will be so without contest. It will be so without hostility, without dispute. Verses 4 to 6. Fear not, for thou shalt not be ashamed, neither be thou confounded, for thou shalt not be put to shame. For thou shalt forget the shame of thy youth, and shalt not remember the reproach of thy widowhood any more. For thy Maker is thine husband, the Lord of hosts is his name, and thy Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel. The God of the whole earth shall he be called. For the Lord hath called thee as a woman forsaken, and grieved in spirit, and a wife of youth, when thou wast refused, saith thy God. So now Israel is being exhorted to trust in the Lord. And this is building up, and we'll see this in the next chapter as well. Israel has all of these promises, a long record of these promises of this very time that's being talked about. And not only do they have those promises, we have in Isaiah 53, again, the means, the way that this is going to be accomplished. It's going to be because of the sacrifice of Christ. So they're exhorted to trust. In other words, don't fear these promises failing. Don't fear God's covenant failing, God's promises, His word failing. Don't fear that. He says, you will not, if they trust in the Lord and do not fear, He says, you will not be put to shame. And he means that ultimately or finally. So there is a contrast here between what the present circumstances look like. The present circumstances don't look glorious. The present circumstances don't look like that they're going to be restored as has been promised and foretold. It looks like they're forsaken. It looks like they're abandoned. It looks like that they are scattered. But the glories to come will surpass the sufferings of the past. And there's really a reference here to the creation. We've talked about the use of creating, making, and forming, those particular terms that Isaiah uses very strategically. And they speak of not only the origin of Israel as a nation, but they also speak of the purpose of Israel being formed as a nation, being according to God's purpose, being according to God's will. And so we've already seen them being called back again to their being formed as a nation, as a people. And we see that call again in verse number 5. And also we're getting this promise. And just like we saw back in chapter 50, that she's not forsaken, she's not abandoned. They are what we saw we could refer to as maybe a legal separation that has occurred. And we talked about all of that back in chapter 50. But ultimately, the promise is that her husband will recover her. Her husband will recover her. The Lord of hosts, the Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel, and the one who will be called the God of all the earth. All titles and references to the Messiah in his exaltation and in his reign in his future kingdom. And the word for Redeemer, of course, is that kinsman redeemer term, as we have noted before. But Israel doesn't look this way. In verse 6, she looks like a woman that's been refused, a woman that's been forsaken, even a woman that's been put away to be put to a public shame. But that is not going to remain the case. We go to verses 7 and 8. For a small moment have I forsaken thee, but with great mercies will I gather thee. In a little wrath I hid my face from thee for a moment, but with everlasting kindness will I have mercy on thee, saith the Lord thy Redeemer. So Israel certainly was as a wife that had gone out to pursue other lovers. And Isaiah doesn't give that picture quite as extensively as some of the other prophets, like Ezekiel does, for instance, or maybe Hosea as well. But there is the chapter 50, there is the accusation that comes, there is the call for evidence and the proof that God had not forsaken Israel, but Israel had forsaken him because of their sins. And so they have been left to pursue their own course. But notice the language that's used. It's referred to as a small moment and hiding my face for a moment. So it's temporary. Now, their exile has gone on for a long time, but still yet it is temporary. And we are told his motivation, great mercy, the greatness of his mercy, he will gather. The gathering and the restoration that has been so long promised to that nation. A little wrath, the language that's used there really just describes almost like an outburst of anger. And the point is that with the terms for moment, everything is being described here to be understood that it's not last. In other words, it's not final. It's not final. There is an end to it. It's a moment, a short space of time. And we've also seen promises starting as early as chapter 1 and verse number 9 that he would not destroy them completely in his judgment against them. So he goes on to describe, and notice how this contrast is set up, because you have a small moment and you have a moment, and then he says in verse 8, but with everlasting kindness will I have mercy on thee. This describes, of course, again, God's purpose. Love to Israel that is not constrained by time. God will not forsake. God will not forget. And of course, we have reference here to his loyal love, his mercy, his covenant faithfulness, his chesed, as a kinsman redeemer. He will restore what was lost. And you remember, of course, in the Old Covenant law, that when a family had fallen on hard times and maybe they had come to poverty or they had come to such a situation of debt that they could not repay, they might sell their inheritance. And of course, there was regulations and stipulations about the sale of that inheritance, but they might sell that inheritance. And a near of kin could legally restore that inheritance, could pay the debt, could pay the price, could buy back the inheritance, could even buy back if, for instance, in the case of debt, we saw where a man might even sell his children as servants to pay the debt. He himself may go into servitude to pay the debt, and a near kinsman could redeem them, could buy them back out of that servitude, could buy back the inheritance, the possession that had been sold or had been lost. That's the concept of the kinsman redeemer, this term that keeps getting used by Isaiah to refer to the Messiah. His very role, in other words, the very purpose was to restore what was lost. It's the very role of a redeemer. Now, verses 9 and 10. For this is as the waters of Noah unto me. For as I have sworn that the waters of Noah should no more go over the earth, so have I sworn that I would not be wroth with thee, nor rebuke thee. For the mountains shall depart, and the hills be removed, but my kindness shall not depart from thee, neither shall the covenant of my peace be removed, saith the Lord that hath mercy on thee. So we're getting an explanation now of these previous verses and the fact that this judgment on Israel is temporary. And the promise of mercy and gathering is sure, and it is everlasting. The promise to gather and restore Israel is just as the promise that he made to Noah in the covenant with Noah, which we studied that a while back and saw that it wasn't really just a covenant with Noah. It was a covenant with all of every living thing, and even the earth itself, that God would never again destroy the whole earth and all life on it with a flood. He promised that he would never do that again. And he says, this is like that. My promises to Israel are like that, the promise that was made to Noah. So even though they experience the moment, that temporary time of dispersion, they will be gathered, and once gathered, will never be scattered again. And of course, God explains that as well in his covenant with David. The mountains and the hills, this is somewhat poetic language. The mountains and the hills, they may depart, be removed, they may be gone. Mountains and hills, typically in poetic imagery, are usually symbols of permanence, things that are much greater than man, and things that stand and endure through the fiercest storms and all of the things that come upon the earth. And again, it's just symbolizing that permanence, and that's what is the purpose of this image here. And what he's saying is, in a sense, the mountains and hills, which were thought of as impossible to move, they shall more easily be moved than God's kindness, his covenant faithfulness, taken away from Israel. So these promises are made sure because of his covenant that he refers to as covenant of peace, which is a reference to the new covenant. And we have allusions to that even all the way back in the book of Numbers, in the book of Deuteronomy, in the book of Moses, even in light of that old covenant with Israel in that time. Now we look at the second part of this chapter, verses 11 to 17. Let's read verses 11 and 12. O thou afflicted, tossed with tempest and not comforted, behold, I will lay thy stones with fair colors and thy foundations with sapphires, and I will make thy windows of agates and thy gates of carbuncles and all thy borders of pleasant stones. So we're getting descriptions here that, again, apply to the afflicted and tossed with tempest, that barren, forsaken woman that we saw in the beginning of the chapter. So to be afflicted is to be depressed, is to be miserable. To be tossed has the idea of being driven and scattered as with a storm. Not comforted is to sigh. It's to be sorry. It's to be heavy laden, heavy burdened, and typically indicating that there's none to help. It's groaning beneath a load that's crushing you, and there's none to help relieve or to help carry or to remove it. And so we get emphasis here that God had not forgotten them, even in their sufferings. And so he starts to speak of these future glories. And these future glories are of such a nature that the past sufferings will just all be swallowed up. No longer will they be destitute. No longer will they be driven about, but they'll be dwelling in this glorious city of Zion. And that's the description that we're getting here. The stones and the carbuncles and the fair colors and all of these sort of things that speak of different jewels, and some of these things we're not able to, trace out exactly what we might think of today. And this is a description of Zion in that restoration, with the windows and the walls and all of these things that refer. The language used here refers to just a shining brilliance, reflecting of the sun. And of course, the point is that contrast, a great contrast with their exile, which is all darkness and suffering. So they will be restored in honor and in dignity and in great splendor. And we've already had, starting back in the first few chapters of Isaiah, references to that restoration and exaltation of Zion or Jerusalem in that kingdom. Verses 13 and 14. And all thy children shall be taught of the Lord, and great shall be the peace of thy children. In righteousness shalt thou be established. Thou shalt be far from oppression, for thou shalt not fear, and from terror, for it shall not come near thee. So the barren woman, we're told, will be a mother to many children. And this emphasizes that truth and peace will prevail in the kingdom. We're told that the Lord will teach and everyone will know his righteousness. We have other references to this when the knowledge of the glory of the Lord will fill the earth as the waters cover the sea, and those sort of things that look forward to this time. And Jesus actually referred to this verse to illustrate that those who came to him, the Messiah, that they were those that were taught and drawn by God. That's in John chapter 6, verses 44 and 45. The multitude, of course, in John 6, in that context, the multitude was disputing his deity. And they did not come to him, Jesus said, because they were not taught of God. That's later in chapter 6, verses 64 to 65. But in the restoration, they will come to Christ. And they will know his peace. Peace, of course, is the Hebrew term shalom. It's not just the absence of conflict, but it has the idea of wholeness and wellness, of prosperity, of health, and all of those things. Not just free from danger, but well-being. They will never know the afflictions of the faithless wife anymore. We looked earlier in our study in Isaiah, comparing with how Daniel spoke about, in fact, that there is a time when God's indignation against Israel will be ended, and it will never happen again. It will be exhausted. It will be filled up completely, and it will be done. Now, righteousness that is spoken of here The righteousness that they'll be established has the idea of justice and virtuousness. The kingdom of righteousness is founded in righteousness, meaning that they'll be free from oppressors. They'll be free from those that would terrorize, from those that would extort and afflict, and they will be free from all of those things, dwelling in righteousness. Verses 15 to 17. Behold, they shall surely gather together, but not by me. Whosoever shall gather together against thee shall fall for thy sake. Behold, I have created the smith that bloweth the coals in the fire, and that bringeth forth an instrument for his work, and I have created the waster to destroy. No weapon that is formed against thee shall prosper, and every tongue that shall rise against thee in judgment thou shalt condemn. This is the heritage of the servants of the Lord, and their righteousness is of me, saith the Lord. So you can when you read these verses, it's another one of these places in Isaiah, and there are several that some we've already encountered. We still have some to go. There are places where you read this description, and you realize that this description, it doesn't fit the present age that we're living in now. It doesn't fit any past age that we can identify that has come before. And it also does not fit with eternal ages. Because notice what he talks about. Even though dwelling in this restored, beautiful city, there will be those that will gather against Israel, pointing to the fact that there must be an intervening age between this present age and the eternal ages, when all of that is gone forever. But the promise here is that in that age, in that kingdom, even though there will be nations that will gather and that will plot against Israel, which that's nothing uncommon. I mean, that's been going on for thousands of years. That's not uncommon. But what is different and what is uncommon is that no weapon they form will succeed. It will not prosper. They will be undone. So, Israel in the kingdom, in this intervening age, will dwell just as God promised to David, will dwell in peace and safety with rest from their enemies. And of course, we know that there will be a great rebellion and a great battle that will come, as described in Revelation chapter 20, verses 7 to 9. But that will not succeed, and Israel will stand and not be scattered from off their land. So looking at this chapter and following as it does after Isaiah 53, and we think about this response, this reception, and this call to sing praise. And again, we don't ever want to lose sight of the fact that Isaiah 53, the servant's song, actually begins with the fact that the servant is going to sprinkle or purge or is going to cleanse many nations. His atonement is not just of Israel. It is of the nations, of all of those who believe. Now, whenever, as Israel in Isaiah 53 will come to feel a depth of accumulated sin guilt, and whenever we come to feel such a depth of sin guilt in ourselves, we think of ourselves as only unworthy and deserving only of judgment, deserving only of wrath. And we're tempted to deny mercy and grace to ourselves. But just as this reception reinforces, no repentant sinner has ever or will ever find God to cast him out. Will not happen. Jesus himself stood on the earth and said, all those that come to me, I will in no way cast them out, cast them away, drive them away. So Israel experiences extreme depth of sin guilt. And again, you go back to Isaiah 53 and you read through that confession, how that they say, we thought he was smitten by God. We thought he was afflicted. In other words, we thought he was being punished justly. But then they acknowledge, no, it was for our sins. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was wounded for our griefs and all of these things. And then we see this reception in chapter 54. Well, the truth is, if Christ has borne the weight and penalty of our own sins in his own body, and he has shed his own blood to pay our sin debt, who are we to try to deny him the reward of his sacrifice, which is described at the end of chapter 53 and seen a little more fully in chapter 54, where he looks on all those children that God has given him, whom he has redeemed. And so I just want to end with a few verses. Sometimes we have various ideas in our thinking about God, and maybe some of those that dominate our thoughts. God as vengeful and angry, and almost as if he is in heaven and looks down, just waiting to squash us. But also remember this, just as this here in Isaiah 54 has highlighted his mercy. Here's a few Psalms to remember. Psalm 86 and verse 5. For thou, Lord, art good and ready to forgive, and plenteous in mercy unto all them that call upon thee. Psalm 86:15. But thou, O Lord, art a God full of compassion and gracious, long-suffering, and plenteous in mercy and truth. Psalm 103 and verse number 8. The Lord is merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and plenteous in mercy. Psalm 130 and verse number 7. Let Israel hope in the Lord, for with the Lord there is mercy, and with him there is plenteous redemption. So how did he respond to Israel's confession of sin? He responded by saying, sing. Sing for praise. Sing for joy, because you have been redeemed through the death of my servant. All right, we will stop here and we will close with a hymn.